The helicopter blades were still slowing down when Daniel Cross stepped onto the cracked pavement outside the old 5th Street shelter, and for a moment, the cameras loved him for it. Billionaire tech founder, dressed down in a simple gray jacket, shaking hands with city officials at the groundbreaking of his newest project, a $50 million shelter renovation, funded entirely out of his own pocket. The press called it generosity, his board called it good optics. Daniel never explained what it really was. He was halfway through a rehearsed line about giving people their dignity back when he saw her. An older woman, maybe in her 60s, sitting against the chain-link fence at the edge of the lot, clutching a worn canvas bag to her chest like it held her entire life. A shelter volunteer crouched beside her, gently trying to take the bag. "Just for intake processing, ma'am, we'll give it right back." And the woman was shaking her head, over and over, refusing to let go. Security started moving toward her, the way security always moves toward anything that might ruin a photo op. Something about the way she held that bag made Daniel stop talking mid-sentence. He didn't know why. He would ask himself that question 100 times over the coming weeks. Why, out of every homeless person he had walked past in 15 years of shelter openings, this one woman made him hold up a hand and say, "Wait, let me see." The volunteer looked confused. But Daniel Cross was already crouching down to the woman's level, and when people are worth $40 billion, nobody argues with them, not even about small things. "Can I see what's inside?" he asked her gently. The woman's eyes, pale blue, tired, but sharp in a way that didn't match the rest of her, locked onto his face. Not his suit, not his watch, his face. She studied it like she was looking for something buried under 30 years of dust. Slowly, she opened the bag. Inside, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag, like it was made of glass, was a single photograph. Cracked down the middle, yellowed at the edges, a small boy, maybe 8 years old, sitting on a red bicycle in a driveway, grinning with a missing front tooth. Daniel's chest went cold. He knew that bicycle. He knew that driveway. He knew that missing tooth because it had been his own tooth, and that had been his own bicycle, the one his father sold at a yard sale 2 years after Daniel's mother left them, or so he had been told his entire life. "Where did you get this?" Daniel asked, his voice suddenly not sounding like the voice he used in boardrooms. The woman didn't answer his question. Instead, she said one word, a name. Not Daniel, not Mr. Cross. A nickname, soft, old, worn smooth like a river stone. A name that only one person on earth had ever called him, and that person had been gone from his life for 32 years. Daniel's whole body went still. "What did you just call me?" he whispered. Before she could answer, before he could even process what he'd heard, a hand landed on his shoulder, his wife Vanessa's assistant, murmuring urgently that the mayor was ready for the ribbon cutting, that the cameras were rolling, that they needed him now. Daniel turned his head for 3 seconds. 3 seconds to glance at the press pool, to nod, to mouth 1 minute. When he turned back, the woman was gone. So was the bag. So was the photograph. He spent the next 20 minutes searching the lot, ignoring Vanessa's tight, controlled whisper of "Daniel, what are you doing? Get back here." Ignoring the confused stares of reporters who had no idea what had just happened. But the woman had vanished into the city like smoke, that night, lying awake next to his sleeping wife, Daniel Cross. A man who had built an empire, who had negotiated with governments, who had not cried since he was 9 years old, stared at the ceiling and whispered the nickname to himself in the dark, just to make sure he hadn't imagined it. He hadn't. Somewhere in this city, a homeless woman was carrying a photograph of his childhood. And she knew a name that should have died 32 years ago. He got up. He walked to his office down the hall, unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk with a small brass key he kept on his own ring, and took out the tarnished bicycle bell he had never once in 30 years been able to explain to anyone. He turned it over in his hands in the dark, running his thumb over the worn metal, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself ask the question he had spent his whole adult life avoiding. What if she never left at all? Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. He didn't sleep. At 4 in the morning he was still sitting at his desk, the city lights blinking beyond the glass, replaying the woman's face over and over, the way her eyes had moved across his features like she was reading a map she'd memorized decades ago. He thought about calling the shelter directly. He thought about waking Vanessa and telling her everything. He did neither. Instead he sat in the dark with an old bell in his hands, and for the first time in 32 years, he let himself miss a mother he barely remembered. To understand why that moment cracked something open in Daniel Cross, you have to understand the boy he used to be. Daniel grew up in a modest brick house on Larkspur Avenue, the kind of street where everyone knew everyone's business, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. His father, Robert Hale, worked long hours at a mid-sized logistics firm, the kind of job that paid the bills but never let you breathe easy. Daniel's mother, according to the only story he had ever been told, walked out on both of them when Daniel was 9 years old. No note, no goodbye. Just gone one Tuesday morning, and Robert never spoke of her again except to say quietly, on the rare occasions Daniel asked, "She wasn't well, son. Some people just aren't built to stay." Daniel had spent his whole childhood trying to be the kind of person who stays. He was the kid who gave his lunch to classmates who forgot theirs. The kid who worked 2 jobs through college so he wouldn't have to ask his father for another dime. The kid who, at 23, built his first small logistics software company out of a garage. Ironically, in the same industry his father had spent his life in. Because he believed, deep down, that if he could just build something reliable, something that never broke its promises, he could prove that not everyone leaves. By 35, that small company had become Crossline Logistics, a name now attached to warehouses on 4 continents. By 41, Daniel Cross was one of the 20 richest self-made men in the country, and yet the people who worked closest to him would tell you the same strange thing. For a man worth $40 billion, he was oddly, almost obsessively generous with shelters. Not hospitals, not universities, though he funded those too, shelters. Homeless shelters, specifically, in almost every city Crossline operated in. His board had asked him about it more than once. "It's good PR," he always said. It was the same explanation he gave the press. It was not, however, the true answer, and Daniel had never told anyone the true answer, because he had never fully admitted it to himself. The true answer was this. Every time Daniel funded a shelter, some small buried part of him hoped that somewhere, in one of them, there might be a woman with pale blue eyes who once called him by a nickname nobody else remembered. He never told Vanessa this. He never told his father before Robert passed 3 years ago. He kept it the way he kept the one strange, sentimental object locked in the bottom drawer of his office desk. An old brass bicycle bell, tarnished with age, that he had found in a box of his father's things after the funeral and had never been able to throw away, though he couldn't have explained why if you'd asked him. Daniel Cross had built an empire on the belief that reliability was the highest virtue a person could have, and somewhere underneath all of it, quietly, for 32 years, a 9-year-old boy had never stopped waiting for his mother to come back and prove that she hadn't left because of him. There was a specific memory Daniel returned to more often than any other, though he had never told a single soul about it. Not his father, not Vanessa, not even the therapist his board once quietly insisted he see after a stretch of insomnia during Crossline's second funding round. The memory was small and ordinary, which was maybe why it had survived so long when so much else from that age had faded. He was 7. He had fallen off his bicycle in the driveway on Larkspur Avenue, scraped his palm bloody on the gravel, and instead of crying, he had simply sat there, stunned, staring at his own hand. And his mother, a blur of a woman now, more feeling than face, had come running out of the house barefoot, scooped him up, and pressed her lips to the top of his head, whispering the nickname over and over like a small prayer until the pain stopped mattering. That was it. That was the whole memory. But it was the only proof Daniel had, buried deep enough that even he sometimes doubted it was real, that once, a long time ago, someone had loved him without condition or agenda. He built Crossline, in a sense, to replace that proof with something sturdier, something that couldn't walk out a door. A company doesn't leave you if you work hard enough. A warehouse doesn't stop calling. A supply chain doesn't get tired of you and disappear on a Tuesday morning. Daniel had never said this out loud to anyone, not even to himself in so many words, but every person who had worked closely with him for more than a few years had noticed the pattern, how he over-delivered on every promise, how he personally called clients back within the hour even after he no longer needed to, how a broken commitment, even a small one, could put him in a foul mood for days. His employees called it integrity. His therapist, in the one session he actually attended, had gently suggested it might be something closer to fear wearing integrity's clothes. That night after the shelter groundbreaking, for the first time in years, that 9-year-old boy was wide awake. Her name was Margaret Cross, though almost nobody had called her that in over a decade. On shelter intake forms, on the rare occasions she agreed to fill one out, she wrote a different last name, Hale, her husband's actual surname, hidden in plain sight where nobody thought to look for it. Everyone who knew her at the shelters simply called her Maggie. Ellen Marsh, a volunteer coordinator who had worked the 5th Street shelter circuit for nearly 8 years, remembered the first time Maggie walked through their doors. It was early October, 6 years ago, and Maggie had asked, in a voice so quiet Ellen almost missed it, whether they had ever had a young man named Daniel Cross come looking for his mother. Ellen had said no, gently, the way you say no to someone you suspect might not be entirely well. Maggie had nodded, thanked her, and left without asking for a meal or a bed, which struck Ellen as strange, because most people who walked through those doors needed both desperately. Maggie came back the next October, and the next, always the same week, always around the same date, though Ellen didn't understand the pattern until years later, when she finally put it together. It was the second week of October, every single year, the week of Daniel Cross's birthday. Maggie never begged, she never asked for money, rarely accepted a hot meal even when it was offered, and flatly refused any bed that required her to check in under her real name in a shared system. Worried, though she never explained why, that her real name in any database might somehow be dangerous. Ellen had assumed for years that Maggie was simply unwell, confused, living inside some private story that had nothing to do with reality, the kind of quiet delusion Ellen had seen in dozens of people who passed through shelter doors carrying grief too heavy to set down. That assumption shattered the night the local news ran a segment on Crossline Logistics' new shelter initiative, showing footage of billionaire Daniel Cross shaking hands at a groundbreaking ceremony. Ellen happened to be sitting in the shelter break room when the segment aired. She glanced up at the small television bolted to the wall, and her stomach dropped. She recognized that face, not from the news, from a photograph, cracked down the middle, carried in a plastic sandwich bag inside a canvas tote, that Maggie had shown her once, years ago, in a rare unguarded moment, whispering, "That's my son. That's my Daniel. He was 8 there. He'd just learned to ride without training wheels." Ellen had nodded politely back then, filing it away as one more sad story among thousands. Watching the news segment now, watching a grown man with the same jawline, the same eyes as that boy in the photograph, Ellen felt something cold settle in her chest. Maggie hadn't been delusional. Maggie had been telling the truth the entire time, and for 6 years, an entire city of well-meaning volunteers had assumed a mother's desperate, decade-long search for her son was simply the sad fiction of a broken mind. Ellen would later describe that moment as the first time she truly understood what it meant to fail someone by not believing them. There were other details Ellen would only remember piecing together later, in the weeks after everything came out. The way Maggie always kept her canvas bag within arm's reach, even while sleeping, even during the coldest nights, when other shelter guests were desperate enough to trade almost anything for an extra blanket. The way she flinched, just slightly, whenever anyone raised a hand too quickly near her face, a small tell that made Ellen wonder, uneasily, what exactly had happened to this woman in the years before Ellen ever met her. The way Maggie sometimes hummed a tune under her breath while folding donated laundry, a simple, unremarkable little melody that Ellen would recognize, months later, as the same tune playing softly in the background of an old home video Daniel eventually shared, a lullaby Maggie used to sing him to sleep with when he was small enough to fit against her shoulder. Maggie never told her full story to anyone at the shelter, not even to Ellen, who she trusted more than most. She kept the details compressed into small, careful fragments, offered only when she felt safe enough to risk it. Once, on a particularly bad winter night, she had told Ellen that she used to have a whole life, a husband, a son, a house with a driveway, and that she had lost all of it over something that was never actually true. She never elaborated further, and Ellen, sensing the wound was still raw, even after so many years, never pushed. One night, during a particularly harsh cold snap, 2 winters earlier, Ellen had offered Maggie the last open bed in the shelter's warmest room, only for Maggie to insist another guest take it instead, a young mother with 2 small children who had arrived that same evening with nowhere else to go. "I've survived worse cold than this," Maggie had said simply, wrapping her coat tighter and settling instead onto a cot near the drafty back door. "She's got babies to keep warm. I've only got myself." Ellen never forgot that moment. It was, she would later say, the clearest proof she'd ever seen that whatever had happened to Maggie, whatever had stripped her of a home and a name and a place in the world, it had never once stripped her of who she fundamentally was. What Ellen did know, because she had watched it happen every October for 6 consecutive years, was that Maggie treated the anniversary of Daniel's birthday like a sacred, unmissable appointment. She would arrive at whichever shelter she happened to be staying near that week, ask her quiet question about a boy named Daniel Cross, and then, without fail, find a quiet corner and take out the cracked photograph, staring at it for long stretches of silence, her lips sometimes moving without sound, as if she were speaking to the boy in the picture directly. She grabbed her coat. She had to find Maggie before the shelter groundbreaking crowd dispersed. She didn't yet know that Maggie was already there, standing at the edge of that very lot, clutching that same photograph, close enough to touch the son she had been searching for 6 agonizing years. Vanessa Cross did not think of herself as a villain. Nobody ever does. She had married Daniel 11 years ago, back when Crossline was a promising mid-sized company and not yet the empire it would become. She had been, by every visible measure, exactly what Daniel needed: sharp, composed, socially fluent in a world Daniel, a boy from Larkspur Avenue, had never been taught to navigate. She threw the dinners that landed investors. She managed the image that made Crossline feel less like a cold logistics company and more like a mission. People often said, not unkindly, that Vanessa was the stabilizing force behind Daniel's chaos. What almost nobody knew, not the board, not the press, not even Daniel, was that Vanessa had met Robert Hale, Daniel's father, years before she ever met Daniel himself. It happened at a small regional charity dinner, back when Vanessa was 26 and freshly hired as an event coordinator for a nonprofit Robert occasionally donated to. Robert had pulled her aside that night. She still remembered exactly where they stood, near the coat check, and told her, in the calm, measured voice of a man used to controlling outcomes, a piece of family history he swore her to keep private. He told her his son's mother had serious problems. He told her that if a woman ever showed up claiming to be Daniel's mother, she was not to be trusted, not to be given access, and above all, never to be allowed near his son, for Daniel's own protection. Vanessa had no reason at the time to doubt a respected, successful man telling her a sad, private family story. She filed it away and forgot about it, until, 3 years later, she met Daniel Cross at a fundraising gala and fell for him with a speed that surprised her. She never told Daniel she had already heard about his mother, years before he ever mentioned her himself. It felt, at first, like an unimportant detail. Later, it felt like something she could never bring up without unraveling everything Daniel believed about his own past. And by then, unraveling it felt like a betrayal she wasn't willing to commit. The morning after the shelter groundbreaking, Vanessa was the first person in the office, reviewing the event's security footage before Daniel woke up. She watched the exchange between her husband and the homeless woman 3 times, her jaw tightening with each replay. Then she did something she would never admit to Daniel. She opened the shelter's security system, logged in under her own credentials, and deleted exactly 10 seconds of footage. The 10 seconds where the woman turned and walked away from the crowd, out toward the side street, where a city bus camera might have caught which direction she went. She thought briefly about telling Daniel the truth right then, about walking into their bedroom, waking him up, and saying, "Your mother is alive, and I've known for years, and I don't know how to tell you that without losing something I'm not ready to lose." She got as far as standing outside their bedroom door, with her hand raised to knock. She didn't knock. She turned around, walked back to her office, and told herself the way she had told herself 100 times over the years, that there would be a better time. A calmer time. A time when the IPO wasn't 3 weeks away, when the board wasn't watching every headline, when Daniel wasn't already stretched thin managing a company worth more than some small countries. The better time never came, because Vanessa never let it come. That was the truth she wouldn't be ready to face for weeks yet. Afterward, Vanessa sat very still at her desk for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. "He can't find her," she said quietly, glancing at the closed office door. "Not now, not with the IPO 3 weeks away. I don't care what it costs. Make sure this stays quiet." The person on the other end of that call was not Daniel. It would be weeks before Daniel or the audience watching this story unfold understood exactly who Vanessa had called, and exactly what protecting Daniel had actually meant. for years without his knowledge. For now, all anyone could see was a wife erasing evidence before her husband could look at it, and telling someone, in a voice cold with fear, to make sure the truth stayed buried a little longer. Vanessa was not, in her own mind, doing anything monstrous. That was the uncomfortable truth about her, the thing that made her harder to hate cleanly than a villain in a simpler story. She genuinely believed, or had convinced herself thoroughly enough that the belief functioned the same as genuine, that she was shielding her husband from a wound that could destroy the fragile stability he built his entire adult life around. She had watched Daniel, over 11 years of marriage, work himself into exhaustion trying to prove something to a mother who wasn't there to see it. She had held him during nightmares he never fully explained. She had, in her own flawed way, spent over a decade trying to be the unshakable ground beneath a man who had never once in his whole life been given solid ground to stand on. What she never let herself examine too closely was the second, quieter motive tangled beneath the first, the fear that if Daniel's mother ever came back, if that missing piece of him was finally restored, Vanessa's own carefully built role in his life might simply become unnecessary. She had built an identity, a marriage, and in some ways an entire sense of self-worth around being indispensable to a man who trusted almost no one. The idea that someone else, someone who had loved him first and more completely, might walk back into his life and make Vanessa's steadiness feel small by comparison. That was a fear she buried so deep she rarely let herself feel its edges. It came out instead as control, as monitoring services, as 10 seconds of deleted footage, and a voice on the phone telling someone to make sure a homeless woman stayed lost a little longer. "I want to find her," Daniel said the next morning, standing in the kitchen of their glass-walled penthouse, still in yesterday's rumpled shirt, because he hadn't slept. Vanessa didn't look up from her coffee. "Find who?" "You know who." Daniel's voice was quieter than usual, which was somehow worse than shouting. "The woman from the shelter. She had a photo of me as a kid. She called me by a name my mother used to call me. Vanessa, nobody else on earth knows that name." Vanessa set her cup down with careful, practiced calm. "Daniel, listen to yourself. You're a billionaire who just stood in front of every camera in the city. Do you have any idea how many people try to con men like you after events like that? Someone probably dug up an old photo, memorized a detail from an old interview. I've never once mentioned that name in an interview." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Not once. In 15 years of press, I looked it up last night. It's not written anywhere." For a fraction of a second, so brief Daniel almost missed it, something flickered across Vanessa's face. Not confusion. Calculation. "I just don't want you getting hurt chasing a stranger's scam," she said finally, and the sentence came out smooth, rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. "That's all. I love you. I don't want to watch you get manipulated by someone exploiting your past." Daniel studied her for a long moment. 11 years of marriage had taught him to read most of Vanessa's expressions. This one, he realized with a small cold jolt, he had never seen before. He said nothing more that morning, but that afternoon, he called his head of IT personally, not through his assistant, not through any normal channel, and asked for the full unedited security footage from the shelter groundbreaking event. 2 hours later, the IT director called him back, sounding uncomfortable. "Sir, there's a 10-second gap in the footage, right around the timestamp you flagged. Someone accessed the system this morning and deleted that segment." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Whose login?" There was a pause on the line. "It was your wife's credentials, sir." Daniel stood in his office for a long time after that call, staring at the brass bicycle bell locked in his bottom drawer. The one thing in his life he had never been able to explain to anyone, not even to the woman he'd been married to for 11 years. That night he confronted her directly. "You deleted the footage," he said, no accusation in his tone yet, just flat fact. 10 seconds, right where she walked away. "Why?" Vanessa's face went pale, but she didn't cry, didn't deny it, didn't scramble for an excuse the way most people would have. She simply looked at him and said, in a voice that trembled only slightly, "I was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" Daniel's voice rose for the first time. "From my own mother? Vanessa, what do you know that I don't?" Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it again, and for the first time in 11 years of marriage, she looked at her husband and simply said, "I can't tell you yet," before walking out of the room, and leaving Daniel standing alone in the dark, staring at a locked drawer that suddenly felt like it held more secrets than he had ever realized. Somewhere across the city, in a shelter intake office, Ellen Marsh was frantically searching 6 years of sign-in logs, trying to find any trace of a woman who called herself Hale instead of Cross, not knowing that the answer to Daniel's entire childhood had been hiding in plain sight the whole time, one letter away from the truth. Daniel didn't confront Vanessa again that night. Instead, he sat alone in his study long after the house had gone quiet, turning the same 3 questions over and over in his mind until they lost their shape. Why would Vanessa lie to protect me from my own mother? What could possibly be worse than the truth I already believed? And why, out of every name in the world, did that woman know the one word only my mother ever used? He thought about calling his father's old business partners, the handful of people still alive who had known Robert Hale back on Larkspur Avenue. He thought about hiring someone to dig quietly. He thought briefly about simply letting it go, closing the drawer, locking the bell away again, returning to the version of his life that had worked well enough for 32 years without answers. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was already too late for that. Some doors, once cracked open even an inch, refused to close again cleanly. By morning, he had made his decision. He would find her. Whatever it cost, whatever it revealed about his father, about his marriage, about the entire architecture of the story he had built his identity on top of, he would find her. And he would hear the truth from her own mouth, even if it broke something in him that could never be repaired. Daniel did something that night he had never done in 11 years of marriage. He hired someone without telling his wife. Her name was detective-turned-private investigator Carla Boone, a former missing persons specialist recommended quietly by a friend on the city council who owed Daniel a favor and knew how to keep his mouth shut. Daniel gave her one instruction: find the woman from the photograph and find out everything about the family story he had been told his entire life. It took Carla 4 days to bring him the first piece of information, and when she did, sitting across from him in a private meeting room with the blinds drawn, she slid a manila folder across the table with the caution of someone handing over something that might explode. "There's a family court filing," she said, 32 years old, "filed in your father's name. It says your mother was declared voluntarily estranged from the household." Daniel frowned. "That matches what I was always told." She left. "Here's the thing." Carla tapped the page. "The filing wasn't made by your mother, it was made by your father. Voluntarily estranged means the court recorded that she chose to leave, but the only person who ever told that story to a judge was Robert Hale. There's no statement from her anywhere in this file, no signature, no testimony." Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe she just didn't show up to court." "Maybe," Carla said carefully. "Or maybe somebody made sure she couldn't." 2 days later, Carla located a name from Daniel's childhood, a man everyone on Larkspur Avenue used to call Old Tom, a retired mechanic who had lived 3 houses down from the Hale family for over 20 years and still lived in the same house, now in his late 70s. Daniel drove out to see him personally, unable to sit still waiting for a summary. Old Tom recognized him instantly. "Little Danny Hale," he said, shaking his head with a soft, disbelieving smile. "Well, look at you." They sat on Tom's porch, and Daniel asked the question that had been eating him alive. "What do you remember about my mother leaving?" Tom's smile faded. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that told Daniel this wasn't the first time Tom had thought about this. "Son," he said slowly, "your mother didn't leave you. That's not what happened. Not the way your father told it anyway." Daniel's whole body went cold. "What do you mean? One day, you two were just gone," Tom said. "Whole family moved out overnight, no warning to any of the neighbors. Your mother came around a few weeks later, asking everybody on the street if they knew where you'd gone. She was frantic, Danny, crying at people's front doors. Your father had moved you both across town without leaving a forwarding address. Not for her, not for anybody. We all thought it was strange, but your father told everyone she had mental problems, that it was best not to get involved. So nobody did." Daniel sat frozen on that porch step, the summer heat suddenly feeling very far away. "She didn't leave us," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We left her." And he lied to an entire neighborhood to make sure nobody helped her find me. Old Tom reached over and put a weathered hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son. I should have said something back then. We all should have, but your father was a convincing man, and your mother didn't have anybody in her corner to say otherwise." "Do you remember what she looked like?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back then, I mean. I've been trying to picture her face and I can't. It's like I've spent 30 years actively forgetting her, and now I don't know how to get it back." Tom thought for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Pretty woman, kind eyes, the kind that made you feel like she was really listening when you talked to her, not just waiting for her turn. She used to bring over a plate of cookies every Christmas, walk door to door on the whole block. My wife, God rest her, used to say Maggie Hale was the only genuinely kind person on this entire street. Everybody liked her. That's what made the whole thing so strange to us at the time. How fast the story changed. One month she's bringing cookies to every house on Larkspur, the next month your father's telling everybody she's dangerous and unstable. It didn't add up. But grown-ups back then didn't get involved in other families' business the way people maybe should have. We told ourselves it wasn't our place. It wasn't your fault, Daniel said quietly, though some small exhausted part of him wondered if he meant it. Feels like it was some nights, Tom admitted. You get old enough, you start replaying the moments you stayed quiet when you shouldn't have. This is one of mine. I think about her sometimes, still. Hope she found her way to somewhere decent. Daniel didn't have the heart in that moment to tell him she hadn't. Not for 32 years, not until 6 days ago, in a shelter parking lot, clutching a cracked photograph like it was the only proof she had that any of it had ever been real. Driving back into the city that evening, Daniel gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. 32 years of believing his mother chose to abandon him. 32 years of building an empire, quietly funding shelters, secretly hoping to find a woman he believed had walked away without looking back, when the truth, apparently, was the exact opposite. He didn't go home that night. He sat in his car outside his old childhood house on Larkspur Avenue for almost 3 hours, staring at a driveway he hadn't seen in decades, trying to remember what his mother's voice used to sound like, and finding to his horror that he barely could. A light rain began to fall around midnight, tapping softly against the windshield, and Daniel found himself talking out loud in the empty car, to no one the way people sometimes do when grief finally catches up to them in private. I looked for you, he said quietly, to the driveway, to the version of his mother who used to stand there. I didn't know I was looking. But I think some part of me never stopped. He thought about the hundreds of shelters Crossline had funded over the years, cities he'd never lived in, communities he had no obvious connection to. His board had always accepted his vague explanation, good optics, goodwill, good for the brand, because billionaires are allowed strange, expensive hobbies without much scrutiny. But sitting in that car in the rain, outside a house that no longer belonged to his family, Daniel finally admitted the truth to himself in full. He hadn't been building shelters out of generosity. He had been building them out of hope, quietly, stubbornly, for over a decade, hoping that somewhere in one of them a woman with pale blue eyes might be waiting. He drove home just before dawn. Vanessa was awake when he walked in, sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept either. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Where were you? She finally asked, though it didn't sound like a real question. Larkspur Avenue, Daniel said. Our old house. Vanessa, I need you to understand something. I am going to find out everything, every piece of it. If there's something else you know, now is the time to tell me, because I would rather hear it from you than from a stranger. Vanessa's hands tightened around her mug. There's nothing else, she said, and even as the words left her mouth, Daniel could see, with the clarity of a man who had spent 15 years reading rooms and negotiating deals, that she was lying to him for the second time in a week. Old Tom's revelation cracked something open, and the cracks kept spreading. Carla Boone's next lead came through a records request that should have taken weeks, but somehow moved faster once a hospital records clerk named Priya Desai recognized the name on the request and quietly flagged it for review herself. Priya had worked in medical records for nearly 15 years, and something about the file that crossed her desk struck her as wrong the moment she opened it. A woman named Margaret Hale admitted briefly to St. Andrew's Hospital 31 years ago, the year after Daniel's mother supposedly left, for injuries. Not a psychiatric hold, not the mental health crisis Robert Hale had told the entire neighborhood about, physical injuries. But large portions of the chart were oddly vague, notes trailing off mid-sentence, an attending physician's signature that didn't match any doctor still licensed in the state. Sections that looked, to Priya's trained eye, deliberately incomplete. I've seen redacted files, Priya told Carla when they met. This isn't redacted. This is written to look incomplete on purpose, like someone wanted it to raise fewer questions, not more. Somebody didn't want a clear record of what happened to this woman. Daniel read the hospital summary Carla brought him with a growing sick unease. His mother had been hurt, badly enough to be hospitalized, the same year she'd apparently been trying, desperately. According to old Tom, to find her missing son, and the record of what actually happened to her had been deliberately blurred. He thought of his father, gentle, steady Robert Hale, the man who raised him alone, who worked overtime shifts to pay for Daniel's school supplies, who Daniel had mourned with genuine grief 3 years ago at his funeral. The image didn't match anything Carla was uncovering, and the dissonance made Daniel feel like the ground beneath his entire childhood was made of paper. Then came the checkbook. Going through his father's old storage unit, boxes Daniel hadn't opened since the funeral, still taped shut in his name because nobody else wanted the burden of sorting through a dead man's belongings, Daniel found an old ledger-style checkbook from decades ago. Flipping through it out of nothing but restless grief, he noticed a pattern, a recurring monthly payment, the same amount, made out to the same recipient for over a decade. W. Combs, Esquire, a lawyer's name Daniel had never heard in his life. He sat on the floor of the storage unit for a long time, staring at that name, doing math in his head. Over a decade of consistent monthly payments to a lawyer, starting right around the time his mother supposedly left, continuing long after Daniel had grown up and moved away for college. If his mother truly had abandoned them and vanished from their lives, why was his father still paying a lawyer every single month for over 10 years? Carla found the answer's shape before she found its full substance. Walter Combs, she told Daniel over the phone, her voice careful, retired attorney, practiced family law for almost 40 years before he shut down his practice. He's still alive, lives about 90 minutes outside the city. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He kept circling the same unbearable question. What had his father been paying a family lawyer to do for over a decade, about a woman who was supposedly out of their lives for good? He booked the drive for the next morning. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Daniel, Vanessa sat alone in their penthouse office that same night, staring at her phone, at a number she hadn't called in years, the monitoring service she quietly paid to flag any shelter intake records under the names Cross or Margaret across the state. A service she had used, silently, for longer than she wanted to admit, to make absolutely sure that if Maggie Hale ever resurfaced, Vanessa would know before Daniel ever did. She had known Maggie was alive. She had known for years that Maggie was searching, and she had never said a word. Priya Desai's discovery of the hospital record haunted her enough that she stayed late at the records office that night, running the attending physician's name through every licensing database she had access to. The name came back attached to a license that had been revoked nearly 2 decades earlier, not for the incident involving Maggie, but for something else entirely, something Priya's search results only hinted at without fully explaining. A pattern, the flagged notice suggested. Multiple complaints, multiple sealed files. Priya printed everything she could find and set it aside in a folder marked, in her own private shorthand, worth someone asking about. She had no idea, that night, just how right she was, or how far the pattern would eventually be traced. Daniel, for his part, couldn't stop thinking about the checkbook. He kept returning to the storage unit over the following days, sitting on an overturned crate surrounded by his father's belongings, searching for anything else that might explain the decade of payments to Walter Combs. He found old photographs of himself as a boy, birthday parties, school plays, a Little League team photo where he was missing a front tooth, grinning anyway. In every single photograph there was no trace of his mother, not one. As if someone had gone through the family's entire visual history and carefully removed her from it, the same way she had apparently been removed from every court filing, every neighborhood conversation, every explanation Daniel had ever been given about his own childhood. It was in the bottom of the same box, wrapped in a moth-eaten sweater, that Daniel found something that made his chest ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. A single strand of blue ribbon, the kind used to tie off a birthday gift, tucked into an otherwise empty envelope with no name on it. He had no way yet of knowing what it meant. He would understand only weeks later, when Maggie herself, from a hospital bed, would tell him that Blue Ribbon had once tied a stack of drawings she'd mailed him for his 10th birthday, drawings, like everything else, that had never reached him. Walter Combs lived alone in a modest ranch house with a garden he clearly spent most of his retirement tending. He was in his early 80s now, sharp-eyed despite his age, and he studied Daniel's face for a long moment on the front porch before saying quietly, "You look just like him, and a little like her, around the eyes." "Then you knew my mother," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Combs sighed, the kind of sigh that carried decades of buried weight. "Come inside, son. This isn't a porch conversation." Over tea neither of them drank, Walter Combs finally told Daniel the truth. His father had paid for over a decade, to keep buried. Your father didn't lose your mother, Combs said. He took you from her. Deliberately. Back when his old logistics job was just starting to pay real money, your father didn't want to split anything with her in a divorce, and he definitely didn't want to pay years of spousal support while he was trying to build something for himself. So he did something I'm not proud of helping with, even all these years later. He had her evaluated by a psychiatrist who was, let's say, very willing to write whatever report a paying client wanted written. The evaluation said she was mentally unfit, unstable, a danger to herself and possibly to you. It wasn't true. I saw the woman myself, more than once, across a courtroom. She wasn't unstable. She was devastated. There's a difference, and any decent evaluator would have seen it. But your father paid for the report he wanted, and the judge had no reason at the time to doubt a licensed psychiatrist's signature. Daniel sat frozen, his tea going cold in his hands. She fought it? For 2 years, Combs said quietly. She hired a lawyer of her own at first, a good one, actually, better than your father expected. But legal fees add up fast when you're a single woman with no income and no family support, and your father had money and time on his side. Eventually, she couldn't afford to keep fighting, and then, after she lost custody, your father filed a restraining order against her. For what? Harassment? Combs said, and Daniel could hear the disgust in the old man's voice even after all these years. She'd shown up at your school once, trying to see you at pickup. That was enough for your father to claim she was unstable and dangerous, and enough for a judge, already primed by that psychiatric evaluation, to grant it. After that, she legally couldn't come near you, couldn't call the house, couldn't send anything without risking arrest. Daniel's hands were shaking now. The checkbook, he said, the payments to you. Over a decade. What were you doing for him all that time, if the case was already over? Combs looked down at the table for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had gone rough. Making sure it stayed sealed, he admitted. Making sure nobody could ever find the original filing, the psychiatric report, any of it. If your mother ever tried to reopen the case, or if you, someday, ever went looking. I'm ashamed to say I did it. I told myself it was just paperwork. It wasn't. It was making sure a lie stayed buried for as long as your father was alive to pay for it. The room went silent. Daniel stared at a stranger's kitchen table, feeling the entire architecture of his childhood collapse in real time. He hadn't lost his mother to abandonment. His mother had lost him, deliberately, through fraud, and his father had spent over 10 years and untold amounts of money making absolutely sure Daniel would never find out. There's one more thing, Combs said quietly, as Daniel stood to leave, his legs unsteady beneath him. Something I've carried a long time, and I think you deserve to hear it, even though it doesn't make anything easier. Your mother wrote to me, maybe 15 years ago, out of the blue. She'd found my old office address somehow, God knows how, and she asked if there was any way, after all that time, to reopen the case. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for anything except a chance to see you, even for an afternoon. I told her the truth, that reopening a case that old, against a man with your father's resources, would take money she didn't have and evidence that had conveniently disappeared over the years. I told her I was sorry. That's all I gave her. Sorry. And she wrote back one line, I've never forgotten. I'll find another way. Mothers usually do. Combs' voice cracked slightly. I didn't help her. I want you to know that plainly, son, not softened. I had the chance to make this right 15 years ago, and I chose to protect my own comfort instead. I'm sorry it took you finding your way to my porch for the truth to finally come out. Where is she now? Daniel finally whispered. Do you know? Walter Combs shook his head slowly. I lost track of her over 20 years ago, son. Last I heard she was still trying to fight it, still trying to find a way back to you. Even after the restraining order made it a crime for her to try. That's the last thing I know. I'm sorry. Daniel drove back to the city in silence, his mind replaying old Tom's words from days earlier. She was frantic, crying at people's front doors. Against this new, uglier truth. His mother hadn't just been pushed out of his life, she had been legally erased from it, on purpose, by the man Daniel had spent his entire life believing was the only parent who ever truly loved him. Daniel confronted Vanessa again that night, and this time he didn't ask gently. You knew, he said the moment he walked through the door, before she'd even set down her wine glass. Not everything, but something. I need you to tell me right now, Vanessa, or I swear to God I will find out on my own and I will never trust another word you say for the rest of our marriage." Vanessa's composure, the same careful composure that had steadied a decade of dinner parties and investor meetings, finally cracked. "Your father met me before you did," she said, her voice unsteady. "Years before, at a charity dinner, when I was still working events. He pulled me aside and told me his son's mother had serious problems. That if she ever showed up in your life, I should make sure she stayed away for your own protection." I believed him, Daniel. He was a respected man. I had no reason to think he was lying to me. "And when I met her at the shelter?" Daniel's voice was dangerously quiet now. "When did you stop believing him and start actively keeping her from me?" Vanessa flinched. "I've been paying a monitoring service," she admitted, tears finally starting to fall. "For years, to flag shelter intake records under the name Cross, or Margaret, anywhere in the state. I told myself I was protecting you from instability your father warned me about. But Daniel, I knew she was alive. I knew she'd been searching. I never told you." Daniel stood very still, absorbing the second betrayal in a single week, this one from the woman he'd shared a bed with for 11 years. "Why," he said finally, his voice cracking, "would you keep something like that from me, for years?" Vanessa wiped her face, and for the first time her answer sounded less like a rehearsed offense and more like something painfully, humanly true. "Because your father, on his deathbed, made me promise. And because somewhere along the way, I think I was scared. If she came back into your life, if you finally had a mother again after all these years, I don't know what that would have meant for me. I built our whole marriage around being the steady one, the reliable one, the person who never left. I didn't know how to be anything else to you." Daniel felt his stomach drop at the mention of his father's deathbed. "Wait," he said slowly. "What promise? What did he say to you?" Vanessa hesitated, then finally told him the thing she had carried alone for 3 years. "The last time I visited him in the hospital, near the end, he grabbed my hand and he said, 'Tell her I'm sorry, if you ever find her.' I thought he meant you should be the one to say it. I never told you because I didn't understand it myself, and because saying it out loud would have meant admitting your mother was still out there somewhere, still worth finding, still worth an apology. I wasn't ready for what that would mean for us." Daniel sat down heavily on the edge of the couch, his father's final, half-finished apology ringing in his ears like something he should have heard 3 years ago. Something that might have changed everything if only someone had told him the truth in time. His father had known he was dying. His father had known at the very end that what he'd done to Maggie was wrong. And instead of finding his son and telling him directly, instead of undoing even a fraction of the damage while he still had the chance, Robert Hale had whispered a vague apology to his son's wife and let it die with him. Unexplained, unresolved, leaving Daniel to stumble into the truth alone, 32 years too late. "Everyone knew something," Daniel said quietly, staring at nothing. "My father, you. Pieces of the truth, scattered across everyone I trusted, and not one of you thought I deserved to know." He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the penthouse without another word, leaving Vanessa alone in the dark, finally facing the full weight of a secret she'd helped protect for far longer than she'd ever admit out loud. Daniel drove for hours that night, with no destination in mind, the city blurring past his windows, his father's half-finished apology looping in his mind like a wound that wouldn't close. "Tell her I'm sorry if you ever find her. Not tell my son the truth, not find her for me and make this right, just an apology, whispered to the wrong person." At the very end, as if guilt alone could substitute for the 30 years of action Robert Hale had never taken while he was still alive and able to fix it, he found himself, without quite deciding to, parked outside the cemetery where his father was buried. It was nearly 2 in the morning, the gates long since locked, but Daniel climbed the low fence anyway, something he hadn't done since he was a reckless teenager sneaking out after curfew, and walked the familiar path to his father's headstone under a sky heavy with clouds. "You had 3 years, Daniel said quietly to the stone, his voice raw. 3 years of knowing you were dying, knowing what you'd done, and you spent them building me a bigger office instead of finding her. You let me stand at your bedside and hold your hand, and tell you I loved you. And the whole time you were sitting on a lie big enough to have destroyed 2 people's entire lives. I don't know how to hold both of those things at once, Dad. I don't know how to still love you and hate what you did. I don't think I'm supposed to know yet." He sat there until sunrise, the anger slowly softening into something quieter and more exhausted, something closer to grief than rage. By the time the sky began to lighten, Daniel had made peace with one thing, even if nothing else felt resolved. He was not going to spend the rest of his life protecting his father's memory at the expense of his mother's truth. Whatever it cost his family's image, whatever it meant for the company, the truth was going to come out, in full, starting now. Carla Boone found the breakthrough 2 days later, and it came from the one detail everyone had overlooked: the name. "She's been using Hale," Carla told Daniel, spreading printouts across his office desk. "Not Cross. Hale, your father's actual last name, not the one you go by publicly. She's been hiding in plain sight for over a decade, in shelter systems all across the state, under a name almost nobody thinks to search for. Because the whole world knows you as Daniel Cross." It explained everything. Why Ellen Marsh's searches under Cross or Margaret Cross had turned up nothing for years. Why Vanessa's expensive monitoring service had missed her entirely despite years of quiet surveillance. Maggie hadn't been hiding from Daniel. She'd been hiding from a world that had already declared her legally dangerous for the crime of loving her own son. The next lead came from an unexpected direction. A woman named Susan Okafor, who had worked as Vanessa's personal assistant for nearly 6 years before quitting abruptly 2 years ago, reached out to Carla after seeing a local news mention of Daniel's shelter initiative and, cautiously, agreed to meet. There was an incident, Susan told Daniel directly, sitting across from him in a quiet cafe, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup she never drank from. "About 3 years ago, a woman showed up at the front security gate of your estate, asking for you by name. I was told, by Vanessa directly, to handle it, to pay her whatever it took to leave quietly and not come back, and to make sure security escorted her off the property without letting her get near the house." Daniel's blood went cold. "Do you remember what she looked like?" "Older. Thin. She wasn't aggressive, Mr. Cross. She was crying. She kept saying she just wanted to see her son, just for a minute. I didn't understand it at the time. I just followed instructions." Susan reached into her bag and pulled out a folded, faded piece of paper. "I kept this. I don't fully know why. Something about that day never sat right with me. And when I quit 2 years ago, I took a few things from my files I thought might matter someday. This is the payment receipt. $2,000, cash." She signed for it. Daniel unfolded the paper with shaking hands. At the bottom, in handwriting that looked achingly familiar even though he hadn't seen it in over 3 decades, was a signature. Mem. Hale. His mother had physically reached his home once before. She had stood at his own front gate, asking for her son, and his own staff, on his own wife's orders, had paid her to disappear and never come back. Daniel didn't remember driving to the shelter district after that meeting. He simply found himself there, moving from location to location with Carla and a photograph, asking every volunteer, every outreach worker, every person who might know the name Maggie Hale. They found her trail at the 4th shelter, a volunteer who recognized the name immediately and went pale. "She collapsed," the volunteer said. 2 days ago, right after some big event downtown, we heard she'd gone to see it, came back exhausted, wouldn't eat, and then she just went down. Ambulance took her to St. Andrews, the same hospital, Daniel would later realize, that had once buried the truth about what happened to her 31 years ago. Before he left, the volunteer added one more detail, almost as an afterthought, that stopped Daniel cold in the doorway. "She kept asking about you, right up until she collapsed. Wanted to know if the news said anything about a shelter you were building near the old part of town. She seemed so proud, telling anyone who'd listen that the man on the television was her son. Most of us just figured she was confused. I'm so sorry, Mr. Cross. I'm so sorry nobody believed her sooner." Daniel didn't have words for that. He simply nodded, thanked the volunteer, and walked back out into the afternoon light, feeling like the ground beneath the entire city had shifted a few inches to the left. Everything suddenly unfamiliar, even though nothing had physically moved. Carla caught up to him in the parking lot, her phone still in her hand. "Ray is called," she said. "The fraud unit is taking the psychiatric evaluation seriously. This could be bigger than just your family, Daniel. They're pulling other case files connected to the same doctor." "Later," Daniel said, already climbing into his car. "Send me everything later. Right now I need to get to my mother." Daniel didn't wait for Carla. He didn't call Vanessa. He got in his car and drove faster than he had in years, his hands white on the wheel, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to since childhood, that he wasn't already too late. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and quiet fear. Maggie Hale lay small and pale against white sheets, tubes running to machines that beeped steadily in the dim light. An untreated heart condition finally catching up to a body that had spent years sleeping in shelters and on benches while searching for a son who didn't know he was being searched for. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, 32 years compressed into a single breath, before he crossed the room and sat carefully beside the bed. Her eyes fluttered open. It took her a moment to focus, and when she did, when she truly saw who was sitting beside her, her whole face changed, not shock, not confusion, but something closer to relief, so deep it looked almost like pain. "You found me," she whispered. "I'm so sorry," Daniel said, his voice breaking completely for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I'm so sorry it took this long. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know any of it." Maggie's hand, thin and trembling, reached for his. "I know, baby," she whispered, using a word she hadn't been allowed to use in over 3 decades. "I always knew you didn't know. That's why I never stopped." She didn't ask him for money. She didn't ask for an apology on behalf of a dead man who owed her one. Instead, weak and barely able to keep her eyes open, she asked the only question that seemed to matter to her in that moment. "Do you still have the bell? The one from your bicycle? I put it on myself, the summer you turned 7. Do you still have it?" Daniel let out a sound that was half sob, half disbelieving laugh. "It's locked in my office desk. I've had it my whole life. I never knew why I couldn't throw it away. I think some part of me always knew it was yours to give, not mine to lose." Maggie closed her eyes, tears sliding sideways down her temples, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Later that week, going through the old storage boxes from his father's estate with Carla's help, Daniel's assistant uncovered a sealed cardboard box shoved to the very back of a closet, water-stained and forgotten. Inside were hundreds of unopened envelopes addressed to Daniel, spanning 32 consecutive years, birthday cards, every single one, never opened, carefully intercepted and hidden by a father who had chosen, year after year, to let his son believe his mother had simply stopped caring. Daniel sat on the floor of that storage unit and opened every single one, reading 3 decades of a mother's unanswered love, in a single sleepless night, each card a small, quiet rebellion against a silence that had been forced onto her by fraud and fear. Some were simple, store-bought cards, with a few handwritten lines. Others were longer, handwritten letters folded into plain envelopes, clearly written when Maggie could no longer afford proper stationery. One, from what Daniel guessed was around his 16th birthday, read, "I don't know if you're taller than your father yet. I like to imagine you are. I like to imagine you playing whatever sport you chose, doing well in whatever subject you love most. I don't know any of these things, and it breaks something in me every single year not to know them. But I want you to understand something. Wherever you are, whoever you've become, not knowing you never once meant not loving you. I think about you every single day. I hope somehow, some part of you can feel that even from this far away." Daniel read that one 4 times before he could set it down. He thought of every birthday he'd celebrated without her, the milestone parties, the quiet ones, the year Vanessa had thrown him a lavish 40th birthday gala with 300 guests, none of whom had known that the guest of honor's actual mother was, at that very moment, likely sleeping in a shelter bed somewhere in the same city, hoping a stranger might finally tell her that her son had come looking. He brought the entire box to the hospital the next morning and set it on the small table beside Maggie's bed. She stared at it for a long moment before her hands began to shake. "You kept writing," Daniel said gently. "Every single year, even after the restraining order, even after you had every reason to give up. I never stopped believing you'd want to know I tried," Maggie whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the box like it held something sacred. "Even if you never read a single one. I needed you to exist somewhere, someday, knowing your mother never stopped choosing you." The final piece of truth arrived not from a witness, but from Detective Reyes, who Carla had brought in once the falsified psychiatric evaluation surfaced as potential fraud. Reyes's investigation confirmed something that widened the entire story far beyond Daniel's family. The psychiatrist who had signed Maggie's original evaluation had lost his medical license years later for falsifying custody-related reports for other wealthy clients across the state. Robert Hale hadn't been an isolated case of corruption. He had been one of several powerful men who paid the same corrupt doctor to erase inconvenient mothers from custody battles they could afford to win unfairly. What had started as one billionaire's private family mystery was now the thread that could unravel a much larger, quieter injustice, one that had likely stolen dozens of other children from parents who'd simply lost the financial fight to keep them. Maggie stayed awake longer than the doctors expected that first night. her hand never fully letting go of Daniel's, as if she were afraid that closing her eyes might make him disappear again. She told him small things, fragments, careful not to overwhelm either of them with too much truth at once. She told him about the years right after the custody ruling, when she had taken any job she could find, scrubbing floors, working laundry shifts, saving every spare dollar toward a lawyer who could help her fight back, only to watch that money evaporate against medical bills after the injury that had put her in St. Andrew's Hospital all those years ago. An injury she finally admitted, quietly, had come from a confrontation with Robert himself, the one and only time she had tried to simply take Daniel back, rather than go through the courts. "I'm not proud of that day," she whispered. "I scared you. I remember your face, Daniel, and I've hated myself for it every year since. I just wanted you home. I didn't think it through. Your father was so much bigger than me, and so much angrier than I expected. And afterward, the story that got told wasn't the true one. It became the reason he said I was dangerous. It became the reason nobody questioned the restraining order." Daniel sat with that for a long time, turning over a version of the story where his mother wasn't simply a victim, but a woman who had made a desperate, flawed choice out of love and grief. A version far more human, and somehow far more forgivable, than the sanitized victim narrative he might have preferred. "You don't have to apologize to me for trying to get your son back," he finally said. "Not for that. Never for that." Maggie's grip on his hand tightened, and for the first time since he'd walked into that hospital room, she let herself cry openly. 3 decades of held breath finally released. Daniel found Vanessa in the penthouse 3 days later, sitting alone in the dark of what used to be their shared office, her face lit only by the glow of her phone. He didn't raise his voice. That somehow made it worse. "You didn't protect me," he said, standing in the doorway. "You protected a lie, because the lie was easier than the truth, and because the truth would have cost you something you weren't willing to lose." Vanessa didn't argue. For the first time in 11 years, she didn't have a rehearsed answer ready. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known it since the moment you walked out that door 3 nights ago. I've had 3 days to build a defense for myself, Daniel, and I couldn't find one. There isn't one." "Then tell me the truth," he said. "The real one, not the version where your fear sounds noble." Vanessa was quiet for a long time, her eyes glassy, and when she finally spoke, her voice sounded younger than Daniel had ever heard it. "I built my entire identity around being the one steady thing in your life, the reliable one, the one who never left, in a life you built specifically because you were terrified of people leaving. I think somewhere underneath everything, I was scared that if your mother came back, if you got that piece of yourself back, you wouldn't need me to be steady for you anymore. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. It's just the truth. I chose my own fear over your right to know your own mother was alive and searching for you. I don't expect you to forgive that." Daniel studied his wife for a long moment, a woman he had loved genuinely for over a decade, who had also for that same decade quietly participated in keeping his own mother out of reach. Vanessa reached for his hand, and Daniel let her take it, though he didn't return the grip. "I keep thinking about the day at your father's funeral," she said quietly. "You held it together for everyone else the entire service, and then that night, alone in our bedroom, you finally broke down, and you said something I never fully understood until this week. You said, 'I don't even know what I'm supposed to be grieving.' I thought you meant complicated feelings about a difficult father. I didn't understand you might have meant something much bigger than that, grieving a whole version of your life that was never true to begin with." "I didn't understand it either," Daniel admitted. "Not consciously. I think some part of me has been grieving my mother my entire adult life without ever letting myself call it that, because grieving someone who supposedly chose to leave felt like admitting I wasn't worth staying for. It's easier to build an empire than to sit with that feeling. Apparently, it's easier to marry someone who'll never leave than to actually process why you're so afraid of being left." "I'm not going to stand here and scream at you," he said finally, his voice steady but hollow. "I don't have the energy for a scandal. And honestly, I don't think you deserve the dignity of a quiet exit either. But I need time away from this marriage. Not a divorce announcement, not a press statement, just time. I need to figure out who I actually am, now that I know almost everything I believed about my own life was built on somebody else's lie." Vanessa nodded slowly, tears finally falling freely. "Okay," she whispered. The Crossline PR team, when informed the next morning, immediately began drafting a statement about amicable separation and personal growth, eager to control the narrative before any of it became public. Daniel refused every draft. "No spin," he told them flatly. "No manufactured story. If people ask, tell them the truth is complicated and it's not for public consumption." That's the only statement I'm approving. It was, his communications director would later admit, the first time in Daniel Cross's 15 years of public life that he had ever refused to let a painful moment be turned into content. Before Daniel left the penthouse that night, Vanessa asked him one more question, her voice small in a way he had never heard from her before. Do you think you can ever look at me again without seeing all of it? The footage, the monitoring service, Susan and the $2,000 at the gate? Daniel considered the question honestly, standing in the doorway with his coat already on. I don't know yet, he said. I think that's the most honest answer I can give you. I'm not interested in destroying you, Vanessa. You're not the architect of this. My father was. But you had chances, more than one, to tell me the truth. And every time, you chose to protect a version of our life that was built on my mother's absence. I need to sit with what that means before I can tell you what happens next between us. That's fair, Vanessa said quietly, and for the first time in the entire conversation, she didn't try to argue, didn't try to soften it, didn't try to redirect the blame toward Robert Hale alone. She simply accepted it, the way people accept weather they can't control. I'll give you whatever time you need. I owe you that much at least. Daniel nodded once and left. Neither of them said the word divorce out loud that night, though both of them understood, in the quiet way people understand things before they're spoken, that the marriage as they'd known it had already ended somewhere between a deleted 10 seconds of footage and a whispered childhood nickname in a shelter parking lot. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't come with handcuffs or headlines. It came slowly, quietly, in the way real consequences usually do. Vanessa stepped back from her role at Crossline voluntarily within the month, choosing a quiet resignation over the scandal a forced removal would have created. She avoided public humiliation, but she lost the one thing she had spent 11 years building her entire identity around, Daniel's trust, and the marriage she had convinced herself she was protecting by keeping him in the dark. Their separation proceeded without drama, without a media circus, and without Daniel ever using his wealth or platform to punish her publicly. A restraint that, in its own way, said more about the man he had become than any dramatic courtroom confrontation could have. Detective Reyes's investigation into the disbarred psychiatrist rippled far beyond Daniel's family. Once the falsified evaluation from Maggie's case became part of an active fraud investigation, several other old custody cases connected to the same doctor were quietly reopened across the state. Families who had lost children decades earlier to the same kind of manufactured unfitness reports finally had a legal pathway to challenge rulings that should never have been made in the first place. Maggie's decades of silent, unbelieved suffering became, without her ever intending it, the catalyst that gave other separated parents a real chance at justice. Walter Combs, in his final act of the reckoning he had helped create, voluntarily surrendered the sealed original custody files to the court, ending decades of concealment he'd been paid handsomely to maintain. He never faced formal charges. The statute of limitations on his specific actions had long expired, but he spent what remained of his career, unpaid, helping other affected families access records that had been hidden the same way Maggie's had been. Robert Hale's estate was legally amended posthumously, a painstaking process led by lawyers Daniel hired specifically for this purpose. Decades of owed spousal support, calculated retroactively, were formally acknowledged and directed toward Maggie, not as a grand public gesture but as a quiet correction of a legal record that had been fraudulent from the very beginning. Daniel made sure, in every meeting, every filing, that everyone involved understood one thing clearly: this was never about money. It was about a name, wrongly erased from a legal record 32 years ago, finally being written back in. He never got the satisfaction of confronting his father directly. Robert Hale had died 3 years earlier, believing, perhaps, that a whispered half-apology to his daughter-in-law would be enough to settle a debt he owed his son and the woman he'd wronged. It wasn't, and Daniel would carry that unfinished reckoning for the rest of his life. But he made peace, slowly, with the idea that some justice simply arrives too late for the person who deserved to deliver it, and that the best he could do now was make sure the damage stopped spreading any further. Ellen Marsh, when Daniel finally sat down with her weeks later to thank her personally, refused any reward beyond a promise. "Don't give me money," she told him firmly, waving off the 6-figure donation his assistant had already drafted paperwork for. "Give the shelter system something better than money. Train your volunteers, and every volunteer at every shelter you fund, to believe people the first time they tell you something that sounds impossible. That's the debt you actually owe." Not to me. To the next Maggie who walks through a shelter door and gets told she's imagining her own life. Daniel didn't just agree. Within 6 months, Crossline had funded an entirely new training curriculum, quietly rolled out across every shelter partnership the company supported, built around exactly the lesson Ellen had demanded free of charge. Susan Okafor, the former assistant who had kept the $2,000 receipt for reasons she herself couldn't fully explain at the time, received a private note from Daniel that she would keep for the rest of her life, framed on her office wall at the nonprofit she later went to work for. It read simply, "You didn't have to keep that receipt. You didn't owe me or my mother anything, but you did, and it mattered more than you'll ever know. Thank you for being the kind of person who notices when something isn't right, even when it isn't your job to fix it." Detective Reyes's expanded investigation, months later, resulted in 3 additional custody cases being formally reopened, each involving families who had lost children decades earlier under evaluations signed by the same disbarred psychiatrist. 2 of those cases ended in emotional, imperfect reunions, not unlike Daniel's own. The third arrived too late. The parent involved had passed away 5 years before the fraud was uncovered, a fact that settled over Daniel with a heaviness he carried for a long time afterward. A stark reminder of exactly how much luck, and not just persistence, had been required for his own story to end differently. Maggie recovered slowly over the following months, her heart condition treated properly for the first time in years, her body finally allowed to rest in a way it hadn't been permitted to in over a decade of shelters and park benches, and quiet, desperate searching. Daniel offered her a room in his own home first. She gently refused. "I spent 32 years with no control over my own life," she told him, sitting in a hospital garden during her recovery, sunlight on her face for the first time in what felt like years. "I don't want to trade one kind of dependence for another, even a comfortable one. I want my own space, Daniel. My own door I can close. My own choices." Finally, after so long without any, he understood. He bought a small house instead, 3 streets from his own, modest and full of light, and helped her furnish it slowly, patiently, letting her choose every piece herself. Their relationship didn't heal instantly, and Daniel never pretended it would. There were no perfect movie reunions, no single tearful scene that fixed 32 years of stolen time. There were instead small things, built slowly over many ordinary Sundays. Dinners at Maggie's kitchen table, where she taught him to make the same pot roast she'd been making the year he was taken from her. Long silences that used to feel unbearable, gradually becoming comfortable. Old stories exchanged carefully, both of them relearning a person the other had lost decades ago. Vanessa, true to her word, stayed away from the company entirely, rebuilding a quieter life somewhere Daniel rarely asked about. He didn't wish her harm. He simply no longer wished her closeness. A year later, on a warm October afternoon, the same week, Maggie realized with a soft, disbelieving laugh that she had once searched for him at that very shelter for 6 consecutive years. Daniel stood in his mother's driveway, holding his own young daughter steady on a small bicycle, its handlebar fitted with an old, tarnished brass bell. Maggie sat on the porch steps, watching, her hand pressed lightly over her heart, tears sliding freely down a face that finally, after 3 decades, looked at peace. "Ring it," Daniel told his daughter gently, crouching beside the bike. "Grandma put that bell on my bike when I was 7 years old. It's been waiting a long time to ring again." The small, bright sound of it cut through the quiet afternoon air. And for a moment, nobody on that porch, in that driveway, said anything at all. They didn't need to. Later that evening, after his daughter had been put to bed at Maggie's small house, a compromise they'd settled into easily, Sunday nights spent under his mother's roof rather than his own, Daniel sat with Maggie on the porch steps as the October air cooled around them. She had the old, cracked photograph out again. The same one she had carried in a plastic sandwich bag for 6 searching years, now framed and sitting on the small table beside her rocking chair. "I used to think," Maggie said quietly, watching the last of the daylight fade over the rooftops, "that if I ever found you again, I would know exactly what to say. I rehearsed it for years, Daniel, whole speeches, and then you were sitting right in front of me in that shelter parking lot, and I couldn't remember a single word of any of it. All I could get out was your nickname." "That was enough," Daniel said. "That was more than enough." Maggie reached over and took his hand, the same way she had in the hospital room months earlier, though her grip was steadier now, stronger, filled with a kind of quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. "I don't need you to make up for 32 years, she told him. "Nobody could. I just need Sundays. I need to watch that little girl learn to ride her bike in a driveway where I get to actually be there this time." "That's not nothing, Daniel. After everything, that's not nothing at all." Daniel looked out at the quiet street, at his daughter's small bicycle leaned against the porch railing, at his mother's hand still resting in his, and understood, finally, that healing was never going to look like the dramatic, tearful reunion scenes he might once have imagined. It looked like this instead: ordinary, patient, unremarkable evenings, rebuilt one Sunday at a time, two people slowly relearning how to belong to each other after the world had spent 3 decades insisting they never could. Before he left that night, Maggie stopped him at the door, the way mothers do, one hand pressed briefly to his cheek. "I used to worry," she admitted, "that if I ever found you, you'd be a stranger to me completely. Someone shaped entirely by everyone who raised you instead of me. But you're not a stranger, Daniel. I see it in the way you crouched down to help that little girl with her bike today. Patient, careful, like the whole world could wait as long as it needed to. That's not something your father taught you. I think that's just you, the boy I used to know, still in there all along." Daniel didn't trust his voice enough to answer right away. He simply pulled her into a hug, careful of how fragile she still felt in his arms, and held on for a long moment in the porch light. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and went quiet. The October air smelled faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. It was, by any ordinary measure, an unremarkable evening on an unremarkable street. To Daniel, walking back to his car under a sky full of early stars, it felt like the first truly whole night of his entire life. In the weeks that followed, Daniel made one more quiet decision that never made the news, never appeared in any press release, and was known only to a handful of people close to him. He had a small plaque installed at the entrance of the very first shelter Crossline had ever funded, the one where this entire story had begun, years before he even understood what he was searching for. It read simply, "For every person who was ever told their truth didn't matter, it always did." No name was attached to it. Daniel didn't need credit. He just needed the words to exist somewhere permanent, in case someone else walking through those doors needed to read them the way his mother once had. Maggie visited that shelter once, months later, standing quietly in front of the plaque for a long time before turning to Daniel with a small, tired smile. 6 years, she said softly. 6 Octobers, standing in places like this, asking the same question to strangers who mostly thought I was confused. I used to wonder some nights if I was chasing something that had already stopped existing, if the boy in that photograph had grown into someone who wouldn't recognize the woman still looking for him. She reached out and took his hand. "I'm glad I was wrong." "You were never wrong," Daniel said. "You were just early. The rest of us just had a lot of catching up to do." Closing narration. Some people don't come back into your life to fix the past. They come back to make sure the future doesn't repeat it. Daniel Cross spent 32 years believing his mother chose to leave him. It took one homeless woman, one cracked photograph, and one brave, painful search for the truth to learn that love, real love, doesn't disappear. Sometimes it's just erased by people too afraid to let it stay. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you're brave enough to keep asking questions nobody wants to answer, it finds its way home.
Moral of the story: the story shows us that honesty, love, and compassion are more powerful than lies and dishonesty. The truth will finally show itself independent of how long it is kept from view. Most of his life, Daniel thought his mother had forsaken him. In reality, however, injustice and dishonesty had kept her apart from him. Years of suffering notwithstanding, his mother never stopped loving or looking for her son. Her unadulterated love reveals that one of the most powerful things in the world is a mother's love. The narrative also reminds us that judging others without knowing the whole truth will cause terrible suffering. Though she was just a loving mother who had been mistreated, many people thought Maggie was psychologically unstable. We should constantly listen with empathy and stay clear of drawing hasty conclusions about other people. Moreover, the story shows that money and fame cannot make up for family love or mend emotional damage. Honesty, forgiveness, and significant relationships bring true contentment. Justice was finally done as Daniel chose truth and bravery over comfort. Therefore, we should always stand for what is right, treat others with kindness, and never lose hope, since love and truth can survive even the worst of situations.